Welcome back to another Kentucky Derby profile here on Racing Rundown. On today's video, we are going to be getting into Tapit Trice, the second of three Todd Pletcher entrants in this year's Kentucky Derby, winner of the Bluegrass and the Tampa Bay Derby. Before we get any further, I will just mention that there is a playlist down below in the description where you can check out the other Kentucky Derby profiles that will be updated over the course of this week. Again, obviously subject to when we are able to put them all out, but that playlist will be down there. You can check out the profiles that I've done for some of the other horses and that Eric has done. So now we're going to get into Tapit Trice, the second, as I mentioned, of the three Todd Pletcher horses. 4 for 5 in his career, and he's coming into this Kentucky Derby with 3 wins this year. And this is a horse that is certainly going to love the trip of the Kentucky Derby. So going back to his first career effort, which he actually lost at, but that was going a 1-turn mile at Aqueduct. And sometimes Pletcher's horses need to get a start in them before they'll be all set. And Tapit Trice was certainly one of those kind of horses. He ran third in his first career effort, then broke his maiden in December. 3 really nice allowance wins. Let's go back to Tampa on Holy Bull Day. He was the best 3-year-old that ran the day of the Holy Bull, and there were a lot of people that were talking about the potential that he should have been in or could have been in the Holy Bull. He won his 1-turn mile allowance race at Gulfstream by 8 lengths there, and it was a much better race from a metric standpoint than the Holy Bull was, which was won by Rocket Can that same day. Then Tapit Trice went to Tampa, won the Tampa Bay Derby in good fashion, but he didn't put up as good of a speed figure there. He actually regressed from his allowance race down to an 88, and there was a lot of knocking Tapit Trice after that race that he was a slow horse, that he'd be one to bet against in his next start. And then he improved 11-fold in the Bluegrass, where he ran a very, very good race to win by a neck over Verifying, who himself ran a fine race. And he's looking like a horse that is going into the Kentucky Derby having found himself a groove. I already mentioned, and you just hear by the name, he's a son of Tapit, so of course he's going to get the trip of the Kentucky Derby. He's also out of a Dunkirk mare, and Dunkirk had no problem. He didn't win the Belmont, but he ran a good enough race in the Belmont. So, distance all day is certainly going to be the case with Tapit Trice. Now, he's a bit lighter experienced than his stablemate Forte, but as I said in my Forte preview, 5 starts is about where I would, at the minimum, like to see a potential Derby contender going into a Kentucky Derby, and that's where Tapit Trice is. Would I have liked to have seen another start in him? Possibly, but he's run 5 times. I don't really need to be concerned about him not having enough experience going into this Kentucky Derby. And the thing that I'll get to about Tapit Trice is he's another horse to just finds a way to get there, and that's something that I'll talk about with the pros and the cons for him. Now, obviously, laid out the record. You take a look at the speed figures; they were kind of hovering around the same area. The first start was bad, which is to be expected when a horse doesn't run as well when they're not ready in a first start, but generally hovering around the same area in starts 2 through 4. Then, obviously, I mentioned the big 11-fold improvement at Keeneland in the Bluegrass, and that's the first pro for him. Jumped up from an 88 in the Tampa Bay Derby all the way up to a 99 in the Bluegrass, and the concerns for him coming out of the Tampa Bay Derby were that one of them at least, was that he was slow in there. Now, I'll talk about the Tampa Bay Derby for just a moment. He had a bad start there. And that's something that I mentioned in the cons for him, but he had a bad start at Tampa, and that was one of the factors that contributed to him almost getting caught or almost getting beat there, and taking a while to get there in the stretch. He eventually won by a comfortable 2 lengths, but it took him a while to get going at Tampa in the Tampa Bay Derby. Now, the other thing is, at Tampa, he was very far back as a result of that poor start there. Now, one of the things that I really liked in the Bluegrass was he showed a lot more early foot there. Now, he wasn't right up with the early speed with the 2 Clear the Air and Verifying in that race, but Luis Saez, and I wonder if the pre-race plan was we're going to have him closer to the pace so that we're going to at least try to get him more involved early on just to get him that experience of not having to come from absolutely really far out of it. And I thought that that really did him good in the Bluegrass, and I thought that that was a really good, if that was a designed tactic there by Pletcher before the race, or even if it wasn't and it was just Luis Saez having a good tactical mind in that race, one way or another, I thought that it was a very good decision to have him be much closer in there in the Bluegrass. So I think that that serves him well going into the Kentucky Derby. So that's one thing. And pro number 2 is he's faced and overcome adversity. So I already mentioned the poor start, and then he had to come from next to last in the Tampa Bay Derby, which is not necessarily the easiest track to close in. There have been plenty of horses that have gone on to be very talented racehorses that have run off races at Tampa and in subsequent starts run a lot better. And that's another reason why I'm not super concerned about the low number that he had in the Tampa Bay Derby, because if you remember a while back, we're going to go to 2016, the 2016 Tampa Bay Derby to bring this up, but there were 2 horses, Outwork and Brody's Cause, who were beaten in the Tampa Bay Derby in 2016. Now, Outwork ran a lot better than Brody's Cause did, but both of those horses won Grade 1 final preps. Brody's Cause won the Bluegrass, Outwork won the Outwork won the Wood Memorial. So, Tampa is a track that you're vulnerable to seeing horses, and I should say actually you're liable to see horses run subpar efforts there. Now, Tapit Trice's subpar in Tampa was good enough to get him there, but I wouldn't really read too much into the Tampa race, because Tampa Bay Downs has a tendency to do this, to when you see horses run there, to not get their best effort out of them. But that being said, he has overcome adversity. He had to come from next to last in there, had the bad start, and that's certainly something that's not the first time that he's overcome a poor start. So overcoming adversity is another thing that's very important. And then my third pro, and I sort of talked about this already with the Bluegrass, but he showed more early turn of foot last race. The Kentucky Derby is always a race that it can be very dubious for those dead closers. And can Tapit Trice be a dead closer in this year's Kentucky Derby? Certainly. But there doesn't look like there's going to be a whole lot of early pace in this race, and certainly not to the degree that we saw last year. There's not going to be any Georgia barbecues this year. So if Tapit Trice is going to be able to work himself out around a third flight, maybe between 8th to 12th trip in this year's Kentucky Derby, that's going to serve him a lot better than if he finds himself in the 16, 17, 18 range. If he finds himself in that kind of range, in that kind of placing down the backside, then I would be a little bit more concerned with him. And that's where we segue into the cons for him. It takes him a while to get going. And this wasn't just the case of Tampa. Now, it took him a while to get by horses in Tampa. He eventually did win comfortably there, but it took him a while to get by. Go one start forward, though, in the Bluegrass. Now, you can chalk this up to Verifying running a very good race in the Bluegrass, because Verifying did give a very good account of himself there, but it took Tapit Trice a very long time to get by Verifying. And Verifying is a horse that I think a mile and an eighth is a bit too far for him. And if it took Tapit Trice that long to put him away, and I would say for probably about 2/3 of the stretch, Tapit Trice was the winner of that race, but it took him about half of that 2/3, if I'm trying not to lose you there, but it took him about half of that 2/3 to get by Verifying and to eventually go on and win the Bluegrass. So it takes him a while to get going, and that's certainly something that if he's parked out very wide, or if he's having to get through a hole and it takes him a bit to get going in the Kentucky Derby stretch specifically, something could close up and he could lose an opportunity to get through and get a clear trip to the wire. So that's something that I think is important to bring up. Now we go back to the speed figure things again. I'm not the biggest proponent of speed figures. I don't rely on them for my handicapping, but I understand why some might. And overall in his career, he hasn't really separated from the pack. Now he's coming off of a career best effort last out. It's a better number than Forte. It's better than a lot of other numbers in this year's Kentucky Derby. But the mean of his career is around the rest of the pack. So if someone's concerned about that, I understand why you might be, because he didn't really do a whole lot of separating. Again, I gave my reasons as to why I'm not really super concerned about that. I would chalk the 88 up to him running at Tampa specifically, but that's certainly something to keep in mind. And then the third con, again, I already talked about this. This is a horse that's vulnerable to the bad start. And the start can be everything in the Kentucky Derby. This is a horse that I would absolutely say needs a wide post. I said this about Forte. I would think this even more with Tapit Trice. And it's weird to say that you're okay with a horse giving up ground, but Eric and I were talking about this with each other earlier this week when we did the Kentucky Derby Power 5. We were saying to each other how we thought that this horse would probably benefit from a wider post in here so that he can establish himself in an outside. Again, I talked about my ideal placing for him. Outside, sitting in that third flight group, probably between 8th to 12th. I would think that that would be a very good transition. You transition his placing early in the Bluegrass to the Kentucky Derby. That's about where I would like to see him. And if he gets buried inside in the Kentucky Derby, this is a horse that is vulnerable to the bad start. If he's buried inside, you're going to have to concede of being second or third last in here. I think the inside post was a big factor as to why Mo Donegal did not win the Kentucky Derby last year. This is a horse that you could make a lot of comparisons to Mo Donegal, certainly with that grinder style. This is a horse that I know a lot of people are going to look at and say, okay, Belmont for sure with him, and certainly I agree with that. We're not picking him to win the Belmont right now, but certainly this is a horse that will relish the trip at 1.5 miles. But if he gets buried inside, then he's either going to have to show early foot, which he doesn't have, and then also be vulnerable to the bad start, and then concede being about third last, if not even second last in this Kentucky Derby. So I would like to see him get an outside post around that 15. I'm okay with the post 17, but just around that 13 to 18 type of post, not too far out there. Again, probably my ideal thing would be around 13 to 14 with him. I'm not doing this with every single horse. I did it with Forte. I did it with Tapit Trice because I want to lay it out for them specifically. But I can swallow him being in one of those further out posts, either 17 or 18. But this would be a horse that I would think would do very, very well not being stuck inside of horses. Because, again, this is a horse that's vulnerable to the bad start. So with that being mentioned, that's going to be it for this Kentucky Derby profile of Tapit Trice. Be sure to check out the playlist for more Kentucky Derby profiles, and we will see you in the next one. Have a good one.